Neurochemically speaking, avoidant men don't form bonds through sex in the same way many people assume they do. And understanding this changes everything about how you interpret intimacy with them. The reason this is so important is because a lot of women end up approaching avoidant men with the wrong emotional strategy. You open up, you get vulnerable, you invest emotionally, and you hope that sexual intimacy will finally be the thing that breaks through his emotional distance. But what's actually happening inside his brain is very different from what you think is happening. While you are releasing oxytocin, the bonding chemical that creates feelings of closeness, warmth, and attachment, his nervous system is often in a state that interferes with that process. Instead of that same chemical connection taking hold, his stress response can essentially block the bonding effect you're experiencing. It becomes a mismatch, almost like both of you are having two completely different internal experiences of the same moment. You believe that sex deepens emotional closeness and creates attachment, so naturally you assume that the more intense the intimacy, the stronger the bond will become. But for him, that experience is often processed more like a dopamine spike. It's rewarding, it feels good, it's satisfying in the moment, but it doesn't automatically translate into emotional attachment or long-term bonding in the way you're expecting. So what you interpret as "we're getting closer," he may simply experience as "that felt good," without any internal shift toward emotional commitment. Now, there is actually a completely different neurochemical pathway that plays a far bigger role in how avoidant men form deeper bonds. And once you understand it, the entire pattern starts to make more sense. But before getting into that, you need to understand why the usual bonding process breaks down in the first place. Number 1. Why standard emotional bonding doesn't take hold. What most people don't realize is that avoidant men often operate with a different internal stress baseline, especially in emotionally activating situations like intimacy. While you are experiencing the release of oxytocin, which promotes trust, safety, and connection, his system may simultaneously be triggering protective responses that blunt that effect. A simple way to understand it is this. Imagine trying to hug someone who is wearing a thick, padded winter coat. You're giving the gesture of closeness, but the actual physical sensation doesn't fully reach them. That's similar to what's happening with oxytocin in avoidant attachment patterns. The connection signal is there, but it doesn't land in the same way. This is something avoidant men rarely verbalize. When their system is stressed or internally activated, which can be more frequent than people realize, the brain prioritizes protection over connection. And in that state, the neurochemistry that supports bonding doesn't fully engage. So when you're cuddling, talking softly, or trying to create emotional safety after sex, you may feel like you're building intimacy, but internally, he may not be registering it the same way. The emotional transmission is not symmetrical. Over time, this creates a confusing pattern. Many women experience moments of deep sexual connection with avoidant partners and naturally assume, this is it. Now he'll open up. Now he'll commit. Now the emotional walls will come down. But what often happens instead is the opposite. After moments of closeness, he begins to withdraw even more. And that's where confusion and emotional frustration usually start to build. From your perspective, the bond just strengthened. From his internal experience, nothing necessarily shifted in terms of emotional attachment. He simply had a rewarding, pleasurable experience, something pleasant but not anchoring. A helpful way to understand this is to compare it to dopamine. Dopamine is a reward chemical tied to pleasure and motivation. It's like eating your favorite dessert. It feels satisfying in the moment, and you might want it again later. But it doesn't create emotional dependency or deep relational bonding on its own. So instead of, I feel closer to her now, the internal takeaway can be closer to, that was enjoyable. Number 2, the real bonding hormone for men. There is another neurochemical system that plays a much stronger role in how men, especially avoidant men, form deeper emotional attachment. And most women are never taught about it in the context of relationships. That system involves vasopressin, a hormone linked to bonding that is strongly activated through shared experience, problem solving, cooperation, and a sense of we are in this together. Unlike oxytocin, which is heavily associated with emotional closeness through warmth and intimacy, vasopressin tends to be activated through action, teamwork, and shared purpose. It's the chemical that strengthens attachment through doing, not just feeling. In practical terms, this means that for avoidant men, emotional bonding is often less about emotional intensity and more about shared functionality. Solving something together, navigating challenges together, and experiencing reliability in action rather than emotion alone. And when this system is engaged consistently within intimacy and connection, the dynamic begins to shift. Instead of associating closeness with pressure or emotional intensity that triggers withdrawal, he begins to associate you with stability, teamwork, and grounded partnership. That is where the shift from distance to emotional alignment begins to form. Thinking back to so-called caveman days, men didn't form bonds primarily through verbal emotional sharing. They weren't sitting in circles analyzing feelings or processing vulnerability in the way modern relationships often expect. Instead, bonding was rooted in shared action, hunting together, facing threats together, surviving uncertainty side by side. When two men went through danger as a unit and made it out alive, that experience didn't just create familiarity. It created a sense of brotherhood built on shared risk, shared effort, and shared victory. That survival-based cooperation is still deeply embedded in male psychology today, even if the environment has completely changed. This is where many misunderstandings in modern relationships begin, especially with avoidant men. Avoidant men, in particular, tend to bond more strongly through shared experience and collaboration than through emotional intensity alone. They don't just need connection directed at them. They often respond more deeply when connection is built through doing something together, solving something together, or accomplishing something as a unit. The distinction may seem subtle, but its impact is significant. If an avoidant man is only experiencing dopamine-based pleasure in a relationship, the connection tends to stay surface level in his internal system. In that case, the dynamic is similar to a place he enjoys visiting. He may return when he wants the experience again, but there's no internal sense of attachment to the structure of the relationship itself. However, when a different bonding system is activated, one linked to shared effort, cooperation, and mutual engagement, the emotional meaning of the relationship changes. The experience stops being just something pleasant and starts becoming something relational, something shared, something built. In that state, he is no longer just experiencing you as a source of stimulation. He begins to experience the relationship as something you are both actively creating together. When men describe this kind of bonding experience, they rarely frame it in emotional or abstract language. Instead, they describe it in terms like, "It felt like we were on the same team," or "It felt like she understood me in action, not just in words," or "It felt like we were building something together." What stands out in these descriptions is not emotional intensity, but alignment and cooperation. From a practical standpoint, this shifts the focus away from trying to intensify emotional moments and toward creating shared experiences where both people feel engaged in the same direction. In other words, the emphasis moves from emotional performance to relational participation. In physical intimacy especially, this difference becomes more noticeable. When the interaction feels one-sided, emotionally heavy, or internally pressured, an avoidant nervous system may interpret it as overwhelming and instinctively pull back. But when the experience feels mutual, grounded, and cooperative in tone, the internal response can be very different. Some perspectives suggest that certain bonding systems in men are more strongly influenced by shared action than emotional expression alone. In that sense, what matters is not just the presence of intimacy, but the felt experience of, "We are doing this together," rather than, "This is happening to one person." There are also programs in the relationship space that claim to teach specific communication or physical techniques designed to influence how men emotionally associate with intimacy. One example often referenced in this context is How to Kiss a Man, which focuses on adjusting the tone, pacing, and interaction style of physical connection to create a more cooperative rather than passive experience. The underlying idea behind these approaches is consistent: shifting intimacy from a one-directional emotional experience into a shared interaction can change how it is internally processed. From a broader psychological perspective, what often gets described in these patterns can be understood as shifts in the nervous system during and after emotional closeness. Some researchers and clinicians who study attachment and regulation suggest that in avoidant attachment patterns, moments of intimacy can sometimes activate the nervous system rather than fully soothing it. Instead of only registering closeness as safety, the system may simultaneously register it as something that requires control, distance, or self-protection. This creates a kind of internal conflict. One part of the system is engaging, while another part is trying to regulate perceived vulnerability. When that happens, the body can move into a heightened state of alertness, even in situations that look calm or connected from the outside. The external interaction might still appear intimate, physically close, emotionally present in the moment, but internally, the system may begin shifting away from connection and toward protection. In practical, everyday terms, this is often what people notice as a sudden change after intimacy. A partner who felt close, engaged, or emotionally available may seem to switch afterward, becoming quieter, more distant, distracted, or internally withdrawn. From the outside, this shift can feel confusing because it appears inconsistent with what just happened moments before. However, from an internal regulatory perspective, this is not necessarily inconsistency. It is more accurately a transition between nervous system states. One state involves engagement and openness, and the other involves recalibration and self-protection. The transition between those states can look abrupt when observed externally, even though internally it may feel like a necessary return to emotional equilibrium. This is why interpretation becomes so important. When someone interprets this post-intimacy shift purely as rejection or loss of interest, it can create misunderstanding and emotional escalation. But when it is understood as a regulation process, essentially the nervous system adjusting after activation, it becomes easier to respond in a way that does not intensify the withdrawal. In many cases, what is most destabilizing in these moments is not the shift itself, but the reaction to it. If distance is met with pressure, questioning, or emotional urgency, it can amplify the same protective response that was already beginning to activate. The system, already moving toward withdrawal, may then move further into it as a form of self-regulation. On the other hand, when the shift is recognized without immediate escalation, it allows space for regulation to complete more naturally. This does not mean ignoring emotional needs or suppressing communication. It simply means timing and emotional pacing become important factors in how the interaction unfolds after intimacy. More broadly, couples who navigate these patterns more effectively tend to adjust how they define intimacy altogether. Instead of viewing it as a peak emotional event that automatically produces lasting closeness, they see it as one component within a larger relational system. In that broader system, connection is not dependent on a single moment of intensity. It is supported by ongoing patterns of interaction, shared time, cooperation, emotional consistency, and everyday relational presence. Intimacy becomes one expression of connection, not the sole source of it. This shift in perspective changes the pressure placed on intimate moments. Rather than expecting them to permanently resolve emotional distance or create immediate bonding, they are understood as part of a rhythm that includes both closeness and regulation, engagement and withdrawal, activation and return. When that rhythm is accepted rather than resisted, the relationship becomes less about interpreting each moment as a fixed signal of attachment and more about understanding the flow of how two nervous systems interact over time. In that sense, intimacy is not treated as a final destination of connection, but as one phase within an ongoing process of building stability, familiarity, and trust across many different contexts. In real-world terms, This dynamic often looks less like doing something to him and more like becoming an active participant in the experience itself. Instead of defaulting into a passive role and allowing everything to unfold in a one-directional way, the shift happens when you start engaging with curiosity and interaction. The tone becomes lighter, more exploratory, and more collaborative. That might sound like simple shifts in language or energy, things like, "Let's see what feels good here," or "I want to try something different with you," or "Tell me what changes things for you." The point isn't the exact wording, it's the underlying shift in positioning. Because what tends to get overlooked is this: avoidant men often respond more strongly when the experience feels like exploration rather than performance. When there's a sense of discovery happening between two people, the interaction becomes more engaging for them. It's no longer something they are simply doing, but something they are figuring out together. And in practice, that changes the entire emotional tone of intimacy. When a woman moves from passive participation into a more engaged, responsive presence, the dynamic often shifts in subtle but noticeable ways. The focus becomes shared rather than individual. There's more responsiveness, more curiosity, and less internal separation between what each person is doing. I've seen this pattern reflected in real situations where one partner begins to introduce small, playful adjustments during intimacy, asking questions, suggesting variations, or simply staying mentally present and interactive rather than disengaged or overly self-conscious. Over time, this tends to create a more fluid experience where both people feel involved rather than one person leading and the other receiving. This is where the idea of teamwork becomes more than just a concept. Number 5. Communication during the experience, not just after it. One of the most overlooked aspects of bonding for many men, especially those with avoidant tendencies, is that communication during intimacy can be just as important as what happens afterward. Not necessarily in a formal or structured way, but in the form of ongoing interaction that keeps both people mentally present and connected in real time. A useful way to think about this is through the lens of shared activity. In something like training or working out with a partner, people don't wait until the end to acknowledge what's happening. There's continuous feedback, small adjustments, encouragement, awareness of each other's state in the moment. That ongoing interaction creates a sense of coordination. Something similar can happen in intimate dynamics. Light communication, responsiveness, or simple check-ins can shift the experience from something internal and individual into something shared and interactive. It keeps both people anchored in the present, rather than drifting into separate mental spaces. In those moments, the interaction is no longer just physical. It becomes coordinated, responsive, mutual. Over time, that kind of shared engagement can make the experience feel less like performance pressure and more like collaboration. And for avoidant attachment patterns, that difference can be significant because it reduces the internal sense of emotional demand and replaces it with interactional flow. When intimacy is approached in a way that is overly silent, rigid, or emotionally pressured, it can sometimes have the opposite effect of what is intended. Instead of creating closeness, it can introduce subtle tension into the interaction. One person may become overly focused on doing it right, trying to meet unspoken expectations or avoid mistakes, while the other may begin to withdraw inwardly, becoming more self-contained and less emotionally available in the moment. This kind of dynamic doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. In fact, everything can still appear physically close. But internally, something important shifts. Emotional presence starts to split. Rather than both people being fully engaged with each other, each person begins to retreat slightly into their own internal experience. The connection becomes more mechanical or automatic, even if nothing has changed externally. Over time, this separation reduces the sense of emotional attunement between partners. It's not that intimacy is absent, it's that the shared emotional aliveness of the moment becomes weaker. And when that happens repeatedly, both individuals can start to feel less connected, even if physical closeness is still happening. What tends to create a healthier and more connected dynamic in practice is something much more flexible and responsive. A relaxed interaction style where there is space for adjustment, awareness, and light communication often supports stronger emotional presence. It doesn't mean overthinking or over-directing the experience. It means allowing both people to remain mentally engaged rather than slipping into separate internal worlds. In this kind of dynamic, the focus shifts away from performance and toward shared experience. Instead of trying to manage how things should look or unfold, both people stay more present with what is actually happening in real time. There is room for responsiveness, subtle feedback, and mutual awareness. That creates a sense of shared participation rather than isolated experience. And when that pattern becomes consistent over time, something deeper often begins to emerge in the relationship. Once emotional connection reaches a more stable and deeper level, especially with someone who tends toward avoidant attachment patterns, the relationship often becomes less about surface-level interaction and more about psychological visibility. In other words, the connection doesn't just intensify, it starts to reveal more of what was previously hidden. This happens because emotional defenses are not just barriers to closeness, they are also filters. They regulate what a person shows, what they suppress, and what they feel safe expressing. When those defenses begin to soften through trust, familiarity, and repeated safe experiences, that filtering system becomes less rigid. As a result, more unedited aspects of the person begin to surface naturally. This is where relationships often shift into a different phase entirely. You are no longer just seeing how someone behaves when they are guarded or trying to maintain control over their emotional exposure. You begin to see how they think and respond when that level of self-protection is not fully active. And that can be both clarifying and disorienting. On one hand, this increased openness can create a stronger sense of authenticity. You start to understand the person in a more complete way, including their natural thought patterns, emotional reactions, insecurities, and relational habits. The connection can feel more real because it is less filtered. There is less performance and more honesty, even if that honesty is unspoken. When emotional distance in a relationship begins to decrease, the experience is not always purely comforting or emotionally soothing. While increased closeness can reveal warmth, vulnerability, and affection, it can also bring forward aspects of a person that were not clearly visible in the earlier stages of connection. As emotional defenses soften and interaction becomes more open, patterns that were previously hidden by distance or controlled presentation can start to emerge. These may include inconsistencies in behavior, moments of emotional contradiction, difficulty sustaining emotional availability, or certain relational habits that were not obvious when the person was more guarded. This is why deeper bonding phases are often described as a kind of revelation stage in relationships. At this point, the relationship is no longer defined only by emotional intensity or chemistry. Instead, it becomes a process of increased perception. You are not just feeling closer, you are seeing more clearly. And clarity, by nature, does not always feel comfortable. Sometimes it reinforces trust and connection, and other times it introduces doubt, reassessment, or emotional recalibration. Importantly, this does not mean that the person is fundamentally changing into someone else. Rather, it means that different layers of the same person are becoming more accessible. In the early stages of connection, people often manage impressions more consciously. They are more aware of how they are perceived and may regulate what they show emotionally. As trust builds and emotional safety increases, that level of self-monitoring often decreases. When someone no longer feels the same need to protect themselves or carefully control how they are perceived, more of their natural internal world becomes visible. This includes their emotional responses, their relational tendencies, and sometimes even their unresolved patterns or contradictions. What changes is not necessarily who they are, but how much of who they are is being expressed in the relationship. This is also why emotional connection cannot be fully understood through intensity alone. Moments of strong chemistry or closeness can create powerful feelings of attachment, but they do not automatically reflect long-term compatibility or emotional consistency. Sustained connection is better understood through patterns that remain stable over time, especially when emotional intensity rises and falls. In other words, what truly matters is not just how someone behaves during emotionally heightened moments, but how they behave when those moments pass. The way a person responds when they are not actively managing impressions or emotionally performing often reveals more about relational stability than peak emotional experiences do. As a result, intimacy and bonding are not only about the closeness experienced in the most intense or emotionally charged moments. They are also about what becomes visible in the quieter, less controlled spaces of the relationship. These are the moments where automatic behaviors, emotional habits, and underlying patterns are more likely to surface without conscious filtering. Because of this, as relationships deepen, the focus naturally shifts. It moves away from simply creating or maintaining closeness and toward understanding what that closeness reveals. Emotional connection begins to function less like a feeling alone and more like a lens that brings hidden relational dynamics into view. And this is why deeper bonding is often experienced as both meaningful and challenging at the same time. It increases emotional attachment, but it also increases visibility. With greater visibility comes greater understanding, and sometimes that understanding includes uncomfortable or unexpected clarity about the real structure of the relationship, not just the emotional experience of it during its most intense moments.